All right, hey there, and welcome to this episode where we're going to talk about what to do when a family member won't get treatment or help for OCD and anxiety. Now, in this episode, we're going to cover just some kind of basic things, and really these can be applied to any situation in which a family member isn't really getting help, and you're the loved one who is accommodating and taking care of them, and kind of ultimately stuck in this loop where it's just like Groundhog's Day for you, right? It's like the same accommodation behaviors, the same rituals, and your life is essentially kind of consumed with preventing or trying to prevent them from being in a chaotic state. That's like the best way I can explain it, right? Is you're just trying to manage chaos, right? But the problem with doing that is that over time, what happens is you have to do more and more and more to manage that chaos, because everything you do, the person builds tolerance to, so you have to work harder and harder and harder, and eventually all your effort and energy is just expended because you're just trying to accommodate, right, this other person. And if the person's not getting help, especially for something that they can get help for, such as OCD and anxiety, what happens is that there's eventually a resentment that builds, and resentment, it can just lead to all sorts of bad things. And so, in this series, we've been talking about kind of from a loved one's perspective. So in the last couple episodes, I talked about some signs that you might notice that a person's dealing with this. And then we talked about some things that you can do to start helping them, right? As a loved one of which is not accommodating. And then, in this episode, I want to talk about what to do if the person is just adamant that they're not going to get help, right? And what you can do from your end. So, the first thing I want to talk about is education. Now, we've talked about education, how important it is for help. And again, our goal in this particular stage, in this particular problem, we're in, kind of the first stages of change, which is really taking the person from pre-contemplation to what's called contemplation, meaning they aren't even thinking about change, and we want them to get them to start thinking that, hey, maybe there needs to be real change to happen. And so how do we do that? How do we bridge that gap, right? And that's what I want to talk about in this episode. So first thing is education. We need to educate ourselves, and we need to educate our loved ones. Now, this can be parents educating children. It could be children educating parents. It could be spouses. It could be brothers, sisters, friends, boyfriends, girlfriends, all of it, right? Education, right? We both need to be educated on A, what the problem is, and B, how to resolve the issue, right? Like, what are the options, right? Because just being aware of a problem that's not going to make it better, right? We can be aware that someone has a drug problem. That doesn't mean that if there's no change made, it's just going to, grow and grow and grow. In the same way, like if someone really is struggling with OCD and anxiety, that problem is going to grow if we don't address it, almost always. It very rarely, just resolves itself. Now, in some situations, that's true. But if you're, listening to this episode, I'm guessing that that's not the case for you. And with most people I work with, generally speaking, it's not how it goes. So, so education, right? We need to educate ourselves on the problem. We also need to educate our loved ones on the problem. We also need to educate ourselves on what the solutions are. And then we need to start moving towards solutions. So, that can include, again, books, courses, right? And, support groups, right? All those things are great. And over at Restored Minds, we have a ton of different resources for that. Everything from, online trainings to live group calls and everything in between. So, but then after that, once we've gone through the education process, and the person, you feel confident that they understand what they're dealing with, they understand the options, and they're just saying no, right? Like that, they're just adamant that they're not going to do it. Well, then at that point, it becomes about you making sure that you're not doing anything to perpetuate that cycle, right? Like I talked about in the last episode, no accommodations. And these are after very clear, very direct discussions, like, I'm not going to accommodate this anymore. And the reason we're going to do that is twofold. One, for your own well-being and sanity, right? If a person's choosing to go down a path that's destructive, you do not need to go with them, right? And I know that's really hard to hear, okay? I mean, especially if you're a parent, like I'm a parent, it's like, I understand that's hard to hear, but the reality is that you can't let them just keep pulling you down, right? Like, you have to take a stand and say, like, look, I matter too. It's not just them. Like, you matter too as the loved one. And the reality is that if the person is just adamant that they're not going to get help, well, then you can at least do your part to make sure that you're not accommodating them, because that is going to help them. One, because anytime you're accommodating them, you're just making it worse. And number two is that it starts to shine a light on like how dependent they are on you, which ultimately allows them to see like how big of an impact this may be having, right? So eliminating accommodation, is a huge step. And then number three is that we need to set very clear boundaries for the household. So if the person is adamant that they're not going to get help, you have to have clear boundaries on what's expected in the household if you guys are going to live together. Because, what's going to happen is that eventually when you stop accommodating, you set really clear boundaries, life is just going to happen. And there's going to be a natural impact of not getting help that's going to just emerge, right? It might start happening with problems at work. It might start happening problems at school, right? Relationships, but your boundaries at the home need to stay. So if the person is responsible for rent, and actually putting responsibilities on the person, right? Because one of the first things that people do is they take all the responsibilities of the individual that's struggling and they just put them all on themselves. And again, that breeds resentment, right? It works in the short term, not in the long term. And again, our goals are always long-term success here, long-term recovery, right? Long-term health. And if you are taking on their responsibilities, you need to give them back their responsibilities and treat them as someone who is responsible, And again, this is going to vary case to case. I'm kind of just talking very broad generalizations. These are going to have to be, again, tweaked according to what's going on with your particular life and your situation, right? But these are the kind of steps that I would go through if I was working, with you one-on-one, right? So once we start putting, giving the person responsibilities and drawing clear boundaries, like if that person's responsible for rent, they need to be held accountable for rent, right? Because this is the real world, right? That's just the reality, right? Is that if we take all the responsibilities away and accommodate, what happens is that person's life becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, and they just get used to living this very coddled, kind of safe life. We don't want that. We want to challenge them, right? We want them to push themselves to see what they're really capable of. And so we don't want to accommodate, and we want to set boundaries. And then ultimately, this is the hard part, right? But as loved ones, we need to let real life consequences catch up with the behaviors that they're engaging in, right? Just like anything else, right? Things that we do have consequences in life, and we have to face them. So if the person is always late for work and you're driving them to work all the time to try to get them there on time and you're waking them up, it's like you might need to let them be late to work and then actually have the fallout of that. Because again, and that might sound like, savage and so mean, right? And it's like, I can't believe you would say that, but it's like, look, real life happens, right? And at the end of the day, you can't be responsible for someone else all the time, right? It's not sustainable. And if that person is choosing not to get up and go to work on time and they end up losing their job, okay, you know what? Like, that sucks. But sometimes the person needs to see external things happening in their life to show them that how real the problem is. You know what I mean? Because sometimes what happens is that they just are convinced there's no problems. But when stuff starts happening in their life, because they have to do all these accommodating behaviors for 4, 6, 10 hours a day, that's when they start to see it sometimes. Like sometimes that's what it takes, is to see the things happening in your life that are actually the real, quote, problems, right, of doing this and dealing with this stuff. And then that will oftentimes propel them to say, look inward and be like, look, I really need help with this, right? Because they can start to put the dots together in their mind, like, well, look, I have to do all these morning rituals and I was late to work, and so this is really the problem, right? Now, they might tell you that you're the problem because you've been accommodating so far. Don't buy into that, right? Put the responsibility back on the individual. It's their responsibility to take care of themselves and to get help, right? And their health is their responsibility. Always remember that. And finally, in like the last stages, if the ramifications are happening and essentially the person's just like living in your house, not doing anything, not contributing, and you are just fed up, there are certain times where it's appropriate to draw the line and say, look, I can't live with you anymore, and they need to move out. Now, for a lot of times, parents, this is really difficult, right? And I've been a part of these discussions. I've helped, facilitate these discussions with families, and it's always a hard discussion. But at the end of the day, if you've created an environment where the person just has no responsibilities, right, and nothing to be held accountable to, there's a secondary gain at that point for that person to just not get better because they don't need to do anything. Right. And this is where what we talk about secondary gains in treatment, we need to look at the secondary gain of not getting help. Right. Because if you've gone through the education, you've drawn boundaries, all the stuff we've talked about, and the person's just still not willing to get better, then at this point, there's clear secondary gains that this person's banking on from not making corrective decisions, right? And not taking this on and getting help, right? So, and I've seen it happen where literally, there's this one mother who had to ask her son to leave the house, right? Put him in a house or a room. We rented a room, right, for like a few months, and then that was his like big turning point in his treatment, right? Like he turned everything around at that point because it was like life really like shined a big light into his eyes and like, hey, look, this is what's really going on. You owe rent in 12 days, or you don't have food now because you're not cooking it. And that's really sometimes what it takes for people to like wake up and really start getting help. So, these are just some practical things. Again, it's going to vary case by case. I'm not saying these are like just blanket do this, like a checklist, but really just these kind of phases are what we do, to really help someone kind of move from that I'm not going to get treatment to considering treatment. So hopefully this was helpful, and if you found this helpful, please, we really appreciate your support by liking, subscribing, and we also have some resources available for you over at restoredminds.com, and there's some links right down below in the notes that will take you over to some of our guides as well as some of our premium trainings and live support groups as well. So wherever you are in this, we do want to support you, and so you can check out those links or visit us over at restoredminds.com. Thank you so much for hanging out today, and I wish you guys the best and have a great week. Talk to you soon.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you found it helpful, chances are someone else will too, and we'd really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing and also sharing this video on your social platforms. Also, if you're looking for additional help, we have some resources right down in the links below to help you on your journey. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you soon.